Welcome to the Religion in Praxis Conversation Series podcast. It's our opening episode, and we're thrilled and very, very honored and happy to have Grzymala Busse as our first speaker of the season. He was a professor of international studies in the Department of Political Science, the director of the Europe Center, and senior fellow at the Freeman Spalding Institute at Stanford University. Her research focuses on the historical development of the state and its transformation, political parties, religion and politics, and post-communist politics. Other areas of interest include populism, informal institutions, and the role of temporality and causal mechanisms in social science explanations. She is the author of 3 books and many articles. I'll just name 3 major books: Redeeming the Communist Past, The Regeneration of Communist Successor Parties, published by Cambridge University Press; Rebuilding Leviathan, Party Competition and State Development in Post-Communist Europe, again, Cambridge University Press; and my favorite of her books, Nations Under God, How Churches Use Moral Authority to Influence Politics, Princeton University Press. She's also a recipient of numerous awards and prestigious fellowships. A few of them are Carnegie and Guggenheim fellowships. The focus of today's conversation is her new book, which is The Sacred Foundations of Europe. Title of today's talk is Tilly Goes to Church, the Religious and Medieval Roots of the European State. Anyway, we're very thrilled to have an opportunity to host you today, Professor Grzymala Busse, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I didn't prepare a formal presentation. I wasn't sure didn't quite get the ground rules. But let me talk briefly about the argument of the book. I basically argue that in order to understand the formation of the European state, we need to look at the medieval Catholic Church and the ways in which conflict with this church and emulation of church templates really laid the ground for subsequent state formation. Now, the dominant account of state formation in Europe has always been the bellecist account. And these are people like Charles Tilly, Bean, to some extent Spreut, and others, who basically argued that to understand the formation of the state, we need to look at the early modern period, where the massive, violent warfare between states led to 2 different developments. On the one hand, a consolidation of states from many into far fewer. The famous line is Charles Tilly's, where he says that there are 400 states or something like that around 1400, and that drops down to 30 by 1900. So there's a consolidation of states going on the one hand, and on the other, these pressures of warfare lead states to form institutions of taxation, of parliaments, of representation, and so on. So warfare basically in the early modern period between secular rulers leads to the consolidation of territorial states on the one hand, and to the sort of functional rise of taxes and parliaments. And what I argue instead is that if Tilly's famous line skates over the fact that the fragmentation actually persists up until the mid-19th century, that there is no consolidation of states during the early modern period. It all occurs much, much later during the 19th century. And the fact on the ground for the vast majority of history, including the early modern period, is a highly fragmented Holy Roman Empire, a very fragmented Italy, and those are basically not consolidating in any way through warfare in the early modern period. And there's the reason behind this is because the causes of territorial fragmentation and consolidation basically we need to go much further to explain that. And that is basically the kind of papal warfare and papal conflict that we see in the 13th and 12th centuries, where basically beginning with even before the investiture conflict, popes are chafing underneath these powerful Holy Roman emperors and their constant incursions into territory. And what they basically wind up doing is gathering allies who are also worried about the Holy Roman Empire and making sure that the Holy Roman Empire fragments into a whole bunch of little principalities, and the Roman Emperor withdraws from Italy, never attains centralized power, and is always constantly beholden to all these tiny principalities. So it's the church that leads to the fragmentation of Europe, and its fragmentation is persistent because once these territories are fragmented, the local bishops, the local rulers, the local princes all have as a vested interest to maintain this fragmentation. And the Holy Roman Emperor never really regains the centralized power that he would like. So the story of territorial consolidation, basically, that the bellecists have told us is wrong because the fragmentation is persistent and it has religious orders. So what about the domestic institutional story? Well, here it turns out that institutions such as taxes and parliaments and the rule of law are not simply functional responses to the pressures of early modern warfare. Instead, they all arise much, much earlier. There's a legal revolution that takes place in the church and in civil law as well, with the rediscovery of Roman law in the 11th and 12th centuries. And what you basically have is the first universities come online in 1088 as law schools in Bologna. You have the founding of the rule of law and the rediscovery of law, on the one hand, between church canon law and civil law going hand in hand, mutually influencing each other. You also have the rise of parliaments that, as Deborah Buchayanis shows in her fantastic books, were originally served as legal courts, right? They're the places for the adjudication of disputes. But insofar as they served a representative role in these adjudication of disputes, it's all because of the church and the templates of what do councils look like? What does proctorial representation look like? Why is it that these representatives function not as, they basically function as delegates, not simply with, they actually have a mandate rather than functioning simply as delegates. All of this has to do with the church and the templates that the church gives for the rise of parliaments, most of which arise in the 13th century, much, much earlier, and certainly not long before the early modern period. And finally, when it comes to taxation, as Lisa Blades and others have shown, crusade taxes were sort of a fundamental way in which the secular rulers learned how to collect taxes. And so what we see is the church, on the one hand, pioneering tax collection strategies and tactics, and secular rulers taking it up. So these sort of famous institutions of law, parliaments, and taxation all arise much, much earlier, and they all arise in response to the Catholic Church's templates and to the conflict with the Catholic Church in the first place. So basically, this is a revisionist view that's based on a lot of historiographical work that's been done in the intervening time. But the importance of the church and sort of shaping fundamentally what the European state looks like. Now, the critique of bellecists has already, the bellicist account has come under fire from people who've taken a look at Latin America and Africa and simply not seen the same patterns. And what I'm trying to do here is to also question the applicability of those kinds of templates to Europe itself. The European state formation has always been seen the archetype against which other instances of state formation are not necessarily being measured, but they're certainly being compared to. And I think our basis for comparison ought to be different. It's not these early modern warfare-driven states. It's a much more sort of complicated process that's willy-nilly driven by emulation, religious conflict, and all of it is happening in the Middle Ages as opposed to the early modern period.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And there are a lot of interesting questions which are out there. And thanks to Andrea, who's a good colleague of mine, for preparing for this talk. So when we talk about territories and territorial control in the Middle Ages or pre-Westphalian period, what does territorial control entail in Europe? Of course, unfold that. Another question is, how different was it from our modern understanding of jurisdictional boundaries and monopoly of violence within territorial limits? Right.
So the two things I would say is that boundaries mean something very different, right? So control of territory is not what we think of as modern states, right? There is no full legibility. There is no ability to see where what every citizen is doing. There's no ability to broadcast power, central power, into every area. And boundaries, that's the second part, are also much more porous. So we can think of more as these are more like radio stations broadcasting power. But there's overlap. There are places where there's silence and there's no sort of territorial authority being exercised. It's very, very different from our image of these crisply delineated national boundaries. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, we used to have an image of medieval authority being exercised through a system of feudalism, right? This fairly crisply defined hierarchy with the king at the top and the nobles and their vassals and then the peasants at the very bottom. And what historians have really done since basically the late 1990s is to show us that this is a wrong image. we very rarely see these crisp cellular structures. We very rarely see this kind of hierarchy. There are reciprocal relationships everywhere. That's absolutely the case, but they're not neatly arranged in these hierarchies. And so instead, the best way to think of medieval authority is as occurring on multiple levels, as overlapping, and as never being very crisply defined. And that authority also takes different forms. I think it's this sort of third difference. We don't have this sort of modern state's monopoly on violence. Most kings ruled not by threatening their nobles to throw them in jail, but instead by cajoling and persuading and getting the nobles on board to fund and to support whatever projects the king wanted. So again, it's a very different image from the modern state, and certainly a different image from sort of crisply defined territorial authority with crisply defined functions and with the sort of threat of the monopoly of violence always looming in the background.
And the second question was, how did the medieval church exercise its power, obviously, over space and people? And was it one among many forms of political special units that existed before the modern state, or was it fundamentally different from other forms of power and other actors in medieval Europe?
So the medieval church has an interesting contradiction, because on the one hand, it doesn't control territory the same way that kings want to control territory. There are the papal states, which are very much the temporal possessions of the church. But for the most part, the church makes this claim that it exercises universal power over the entire world. It has the access to the divine. Its power is both spiritually and divinely inspired. And so this makes these very universal claims about church authority extending everywhere. And these, of course, get contested, they get modified. But the fundamental aspect here is that this is not something that respects any kind of territorial boundaries, on the one hand. On the other hand, the church really reifies subsequent territorial division of Europe, because it itself is organized into bishoprics and parishes, which are fundamentally territorial units, right? So bishops exercise authority over multiple parishes within which priests exercise authority defined by territory, right? And so on the one hand, the church makes these very broad claims about its authority extending over all of Christendom. On the other, it very much lays down the groundwork for the subsequent territorial division of authority in Europe by operating through parishes and bishoprics and dividing up its authority that way.
And what I find interesting in my work in Orthodox Christian churches, for example, there is a significant and striking difference between canonical territories of the church and territorial borders of the state, which in practice means that there are, again, if we kind of zoom into the current conflict and war in Ukraine, the spiritual space, canonical, is part of the Russian canonical territory. So I wonder if overwhelmingly, there is a dispute between them and Constantinople, but 12,000 parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church are physically located in the Ukrainian territory. So that, of course, creates conflicts. And that seems to be the problem of Orthodox Christianity, by and large, saying that there is an ambiguity on the one hand on territoriality and sort of spatial dimensions of nationhood or religion, ethnicity, and the canonical part. Is there such conflict in Catholic Church, or how does that work in medieval Europe?
So we don't see much of that at all. Instead, what we see, especially in Scandinavia and in Poland, bishoprics being defined contiguously with the state, right? And again, to speak of the state in the medieval ages is an anachronism, but forgive me the shorthand. But instead, what we see is, for example, both in Scandinavia and around the periphery, in Poland and Bohemia, bishoprics being contiguous with the country itself or the territorial claims of the kings, and in fact reinforcing those territorial claims and reinforcing state building by bishops, for example, making sure that those borders are respected by by preaching, by sending out their administrators and having them only go as far as the boundaries of the state/bishopric. So what we see in Western Christendom is a very different relationship between the state and church, as of course in the first place, but it also is manifest on this very low level where the territorial boundaries of the state are respected by the bishoprics. And in fact, in some places created by the bishoprics, because those are the lines that are being followed in territorial disputes in some cases.
Was there any difference in terms of state formation in Catholic and Reformed Protestant regions?
I think the really big difference is between Eastern Christendom and Western Christendom, right? And the difference there is basically in 1054 with the Great Schism. In the East, you have the state and the church cleaving together. In the West, you have them enter into a period of conflict. And as a result, you have legacies of this to this day, right? The churches are very much seen as separate from the state. Even in places like Protestant countries where the state, basically runs the churches, the state controls the churches, they're seen as distinct entities. Whereas in Eastern Christendom, they're seen as much more part of the state itself. And what's interesting is that also changes the kinds of claims that they make on the body politic. Eastern churches really care about competition and about tax policy, right? Western churches care much more about morality, especially the Catholic Church, which has been sort of held out of secular power in most places. They really care about that much more. When it comes to the difference between state formation in Protestant and Catholic countries, it's interesting because, of course, the obvious difference is that the state runs the churches in the Protestant countries, right? Clergy become state employees. There are consistories where basically you have joint representatives on the local level, sort of enforcing morality policy. Philip Gorski has a wonderful book on the confessionalization of the state, right? And the ways in which the two are sort of, work hand in hand. But even in the Catholic countries, with the Reformation, kings start to control the church. They start to name bishops. They start to control the flow of information. They grab resources from the church. And they make it very clear to the Catholic Church that if you want to survive in Spain or in France, you better subordinate some of your claims to our needs. And so I think, the big difference really is not so much in the processes of state formation as in who does the state forming, right? Whether it's just, sort of in the Reformation period in the Catholic Church areas, it's really just secular officials. In the Protestant areas, it's much more likely to be clergy and quote unquote secular officials working together.
I have a question about the sort of scope of the argument in terms of the, again, geographic limits. And is it limited to the Western and Central European Catholic states, or can it be applied to Eastern European Orthodox states or countries with different dominant religion? Especially interesting question, again, given the research focus which I'm, what I'm engaged with.
Right. So I think, again, to me, the big difference in the scope condition here really is Western Christendom. And the reason for that is because Eastern Christendom is just basically, again, after 1054, takes such a different tack, right? It is basically, the Byzantine emperors from the very beginning exercised so much more control over the church. And it's the exact, basically, mirror image of what we see in Western Christendom. So rather than playing this active role in developing its own independent templates, instead of showing secular rulers how they can develop taxation or parliaments or anything like that, the church is much more likely to follow in the footsteps of the state. And as a result, if you look at me, I'm not obviously an expert on the Byzantine state, but what you see there is much more continuity with Rome, right? Even the names of the offices are similar. The division of labor looks very different. The hierarchy of officials looks very different. So I'm very much limiting this argument to Western Christendom because as fascinating as the Eastern Christian cases are, they follow a very different path after the schism.
And another question is what happened after 1648 to the Catholic Church and its territorial jurisdiction. Did it evaporate, and what happened to this causal process of church shaping the institutional capacity and character of now sovereign states?
Right. So I think, the first thing I would say is I think 1648 is not quite the clear demarcation line that we would like it to be. There's been a lot of stuff, work that contests the idea that Westphalia somehow establishes sovereignty. In fact, notions of sovereignty are already present much, much earlier. But insofar as the church continues to influence politics, the Pope still has his papal territories. He continues to make universal claims. The church is omnipresent. But now what the church has to do is to basically, the idea that it would make any kind of universal claims on secular rulers has really dissipated. And it dissipated long before 1648. It really dissipated with the schism within the church, right? And so basically, during the sort of Babylonian exile in Avignon, and then the sort of, the era of multiple popes, that basically from the end of the 14th century to the middle of the 15th, that already dissipated any of those claims because the church showed itself not to be this sort of, grand universal authority, but to be composed of people politicking and making alliances and creating coalitions in order to get to the top seat. And so you don't see the church exercising as much moral authority. It certainly doesn't have as much access. It no longer can sort of, call upon its allies and send armies into territory. And so it now has to work, it's on the back foot, and it has to work much more indirectly. So, the Pope will still excommunicate rulers, they'll still make grand pronouncements, but no one expects this to hold as much water as it would have in, say, the 13th century.
Many thanks. So I have a question from Matisse. So he wonders about the political agency of the church at the level below the papacy. For example, the role of archbishops, electors in the Holy Roman Empire, those of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. Can you talk about their role, he asks? So did they pursue fragmentation, and are there examples of that?
Right. So the archbishops, just for those who might not be familiar, there's a whole bunch of so-called prince bishops in the Holy Roman Empire, clergy who also exercise territorial authority. And 3 of them are elevated to the status of electors. There are 7 total electors, and they choose the emperor. So these are incredibly powerful people, and everybody recognizes this. I think what's really interesting about this is that on the one hand, these are the some of the key officials insofar as there is an imperial administration, right? One of them, for example, serves as the arch-chancellor. The Archbishop of Mainz is traditionally the arch-chancellor of the empire. So on one hand, they're deeply sort of embedded in the sort of exercise of authority within the Holy Roman Empire. On the other hand, it is very much in their interest to protect their own territorial authority and to preclude the emperor from centralizing authority. And so they are no different from all the other all the other princes, who basically after 1358 in the Golden Bull make it very clear that they are going to retain their power. And if the emperor wants to get anything done, he has to sort of guarantee those rights to them. So they're very much part of the fragmentation of Europe and fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire, and sustaining that fragmentation by vociferously defending their territorial authority rights, just like all the other princes did.
Many thanks. Professor Giannodia asks, to follow up on Tornica's question about state building in Protestant realms, the argument, as I understood, he says, it is that Catholic Church created institutional templates that secular rulers used. But what about Protestant rulers? Did Protestants, whatever theological differences, also follow institutional templates created by the Catholic Church? Or their templates were somehow different? And secondly, did the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, or different kinds of Protestants, contribute to the evolution of modern Western states?
So could you repeat the second question? Because I was writing down the first question.
So the second question is, did the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, or different kinds of Protestants, contribute to the evolution of the modern Western state?
Yeah, okay. So first, about Protestant rulers following Catholic institutional templates. Insofar as those templates had already been institutionalized in those territories, they continue to function. So parliaments, for example, function everywhere. There's of course an absolutist turn, right? And so many of these parliaments just become talking shops, or they basically fail to meet. But that happens in both Catholic and Protestant countries, right? There's no sort of distinction. It's not as if Protestant parliaments are somehow more or less active than Catholic ones. So the sort of structures of the rule of law, of parliaments, of administration, of taxation, all remain on the ground. And so Protestant rulers continue to follow those. Mostly because by that point, they're not seen as Catholic templates. They're just seen as what you have. These are the familiar institutions that we have, right? I mean, it's kind of like, the educational calendar still follows highly agricultural patterns, giving kids the summer off. But it doesn't really occur to anyone to change it simply because we're now an industrialized society. So the inertia and the path dependence really seem to carry the day. And when it comes to sort of religious conflict and how that influences state formation. So, again, I think where this really plays out are in these sort of, on the local level, in the smaller differences between how local populations are governed, right? So in Geneva, you have a very powerful consistory where, the Calvinists basically rule the city. In Lutheran countries, this is much less sort of evident, but you still have, the two of them working hand in hand. And in Catholic countries, there's sort of a separation and the subordination of the church to state without the kind of, comprehensive involvement of the clergy in the state. So I think those are the kinds of differences that we see. And of course, the religious conflicts change to some extent national boundaries. They certainly play a huge role in determining who gets to be ruler and who doesn't, depending on who wins which conflict. But I don't think, religious conflict per se shaped states nearly as much as it did in this earlier medieval period.
Question from Andrea Mirabishvili. Particular bishops also exercised territorial lordship, and when bishops got sovereign rights, quote, over cities, these cities, quote, asserted the right to govern themselves, end of quote, page 22. And does it mean that these bishops, at least locally in particular, defined space in a city given to them, they exercised sovereign right without having to share with the non-religious lord? Did they collect tax, control the military or policing force, or exercise judicial power?
So, as always in the Middle Ages, the answer is it depends. In some places, there are certain communes in Italy and certain areas in Germany where they certainly exercised that kind of power, where they were basically, collecting taxes and had a council that was assisting them, and they really sort of served a really important role in local governments. In other places, they were in a constant conflict with the citizens and with the council that would govern the city. So it really depended. And as a result, when you sort of look at sort of the overall regressions, bishops don't necessarily help communes to arise, right? Some bishops, actively fight them, and they actively fight sort of autonomous local governance. Others are more than happy to benefit from it. And so, the story of bishops as secular rulers varies incredibly. They're given various different sets of powers in different territory. They can sustain those powers differently, and they come into conflict with different kinds of actors. But the idea that bishops can exercise territorial authority is very much present. And we see that in the Holy Roman Empire. We see that in northern Italy, where they basically function in some cases as local princes and govern exactly that way, exercising jurisdiction, settling disputes, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and so on.
Excellent. Any further questions from the audience? If there are no questions, we won't keep too much of the time, and of course we're very, very happy to follow up on our blog, which is religionandpraxis.com, and we'll be happy to publish some of the key takeaways from this brief episode. And another one here is about the flows of money to the papacy in medieval Europe. And the question is, can you briefly elaborate on the flows of money and how does that sort of function? Right.
So the papacy basically taxes all of Europe. For the most part, these are clerical taxes. So there's the clerical tenth. They basically collect money from clergy, from bishops, from parishes. They also understand that the local clergy collects money and then uses that to basically provide local welfare goods. And so, it's not that heavy a taxation burden. But the papacy always collects taxes from basically all the clergy, all the bishops in Europe. The other flow of money, of course, eventually becomes the sale of offices, where, as tax funding dries up, you can buy an office you can buy a bishopric, you can buy an office in the central papal administration, and that's another flow of money. And the third is really secular taxation, where, of course, there's our special needs that the papacy has. This especially arises during the Crusades, where in order to defend Christendom, in order to defend papal interests, popes will basically will ask for more than normal amounts of taxes from various rulers. And for the most part, rulers are happy to give something called Peter's pence, which is basically sort of, a penny's worth of income per capita tax. They're okay with that. They're not so okay with sort of the continued and heavy demands for crusade taxes. And eventually, basically, kings stop paying attention and refuse to pay. That's part of the issue in the enormous conflict between Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair. But for the most part, basically, the popes make continual taxation demands. A lot of this money flows back into the papacy, but it's never a very efficient system, right? I mean, again, I think it's critical to emphasize that even though the popes were more efficient administrators than many kings or princes at the time, the porousness of the system and so the lack of enforcement is evident at every sort of step. So the popes may have been more efficient than others, but compared to almost any tax system in the world today, they're much less efficient.
How is this Christian foundation of Europe used today? If you can give us just a gist of the argument, some of your publications which I read, but how populists are kind of pulling the trigger of this Christian Europe today? Do you notice any patterns or kind of the scope limitations?
Yeah, so I think this idea of a Christian Europe, and let's be clear. So Christian nationalists and populists don't necessarily reach back all the way to the Middle Ages to make their arguments. But what they do is to use Christianity as a way of delineating who belongs in Europe and who doesn't, right? And they have to be very careful about this because you don't want to sound anti-Semitic. But it's very useful if you want to exclude Muslims or immigrants. They are not part of Christian Europe. That's a statement. Those are statements made by Orban, by many of the far-right parties. In Poland, Kaczynski makes the same kinds of claims. And so the Christian heritage of Europe is being used to limit the sort of who belongs as a citizen, to divide people. If you're truly Christian, then you would accept this. If you're a real Pole, you're Christian. If you're a real Hungarian, you accept Orban's version of Christianity, and so on. So it's used mostly as a tool of division and sort of a shrinkage of the political space, of access to the political space. But they don't have to, go back to the Middle Ages to do that. It's just enough to assert, the Christian Judeo-Christian tradition, or simply the Christian tradition, to do this.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, and we're very grateful. Also on behalf of the audience, and I have to finish this now, and our recording will be available in the next couple of days. And thanks for having this opportunity.
Thank you very much.